Just a broad welcome to everyone to the Honors Seniors Talks. Thank you so much for coming. We have a great lineup today. I'm going to say that, a lineup. 6 different students presenting this afternoon. Our intention is for them to have 15 minutes for presentation time and then 5 minutes for question and answer, just so you're aware of the structure. And each of these students has worked with a project advisor who will be giving their introductions.
Good afternoon, yes. Welcome. My name is Jason Parks. I am the program director for the English department here at Anderson University. It was my privilege to work with Anna this year on her senior honors project, which I'll let her introduce and speak with you about. But I just want to mention that Anna is a senior English language arts major and will be doing student teaching next spring. Was also a biblical studies minor and has a wide range of talents and gifts, and she has just poured those into the classroom and into many places at this university over the last 4 years. So we're really proud of her as a member of the honors program, as a member of the English department, and just a part of this university. And so, yeah, it's been wonderful to work with Anna. And just to say one thing about this project, she took my American literature course last year, and we were able to read some Toni Morrison together, and her enthusiasm for Morrison's work, I think, also went beyond the classroom, and she was able to attend some conferences and was able to explore Morrison further. So I was really excited when she came up and approached me to just get to supervise this project a little bit. I have certainly a passion for American literature and the work of Toni Morrison and some of the issues and things that she writes about, and then as well as Soraya Hurston. So it was exciting to see Anna work through these authors and do some close reading and study, and I'm excited to hear her work this to you.
So as Dr. Park said, my name is Anna Pesio. I will be talking about 2 novels. So Toni Morrison's God Help a Child and Soraya Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. I did a comparative literary analysis of these 2 works, and I focused particularly on the thread of racism and colorism and how that has evolved over the years as represented in these 2 novels, and some of the themes that are explored by each of these authors. So before we jump into the book itself, I wanted to bring a contemporary example into this. So over here, this is Nina Simone. There was a film made based off of her life and her influences in 2016. And the actress they cast to play her was Zoe Saldana, who is over here. As you can see, she's a much lighter skinned actress in comparison to Nina Simone, and there was a lot of controversy over casting such a light actress. She even, for filming, had her skin darkened and had some cosmetic work done, not permanently, but for the film, in order to seem more of an accurate portrayal. And she even spoke out later about her experience playing Nina Simone and said that she regretted that she took this role because she was not the best person to convey Nina Simone. And this has been an issue that we've seen throughout media of lighter-skinned actors and actresses playing darker-skinned roles, especially in historical adaptations, and talking about some of those influential people, the ways that we are much more receptive to lighter-skinned actors as opposed to darker-skinned actors. So we're going to see that as well in literature, in the perception of lighter is better, darker is not. So one of the main areas that I looked at is this idea of colorism. So what is colorism? According to one of the sources that I looked at, colorism, it's not about what race you are specifically, but with colorism, skin color does not serve as an indicator of race. Rather, it's the social meaning afforded to skin color itself that results in differential treatment. So you can have 2 people who both identify as African American, but one is going to be very light-skinned, one is very dark-skinned, and they're going to receive vastly different treatment because of their skin color. Unfortunately, this is still true today, even if it doesn't come out as blatantly obvious as it would have 100 years ago, for example. So when looking at these two novels, we have God Help the Child, which was published in 2015, a much more recent novel. And we have Their Eyes Were Watching God, which was published in 1937. So these books are, I believe it is 78 years apart from each other. And they're both written for contemporary settings. So we have in God Help the Child, we have our main character, Bride. She was born as Lula Ann Bridewell, but she changed her name as a way of creating a new identity for herself. This is set in 21st century California. She's described as having blue-black skin, so very dark-skinned, and she learns to highlight her appearance by wearing no makeup and wearing all white clothing to really emphasize her darkness. There's her maternal figure, Sweetness, who I will talk a little bit more about later, who her parenting is very much influenced by colorist views that are kind of deeply ingrained in her. For Their Eyes Were Watching God, we have Janie Crawford. A lot of this follows more of her journey as a black woman, specifically being a woman in the 1920s, 1930s, somewhere around there. Set in 20th century Florida, she's light-skinned and is known for her long, straight hair, so very Caucasian type feature that she has. And her maternal figure is her grandmother, who is very much influenced by racism in the way that she parents her granddaughter. So that's a little bit of overview. These characters have they're kind of opposite from each other, very dark-skinned, very light-skinned. And we'll see how on opposite ends of the spectrum, both of these characters are still heavily influenced by racism and colorism in their lives. So I looked at two aspects with racism and colorism. One, which was a common theme in both stories, was the idea of beauty standards and how those have impacted these female protagonists. So for Bride, she's a very dark-skinned woman, and she's trying to overcome the experiences she had as a child. People calling her the N-word, people treating her poorly. As I go into the second area I looked at with parenting, you'll also see that her mother treated her very poorly because she was so dark, much darker than her parents were. So in this act of defiance, she's forcing those tormentors, the real ones and others like them, to drool with envy when they see me. It's more than payback, it's glory. So this is when she's dressing herself in all white, wearing no makeup, to really, instead of being this ugly little black girl that she was as a child, she's now something to be admired. She's exotic, she's alluring. And one of her friends tells her, black sells, it's the hottest commodity in the civilized world. White girls, even brown girls, have to strip naked to get that kind of attention. So we see this shift in modern culture where she's trying to accentuate these black features in order to gain notoriety and to gain attention in a positive way. We flip to Janie and Their Eyes Were Watching God, and her being very light-skinned, she has experiences, particularly with this one woman that she encounters, who idolizes her because she's lighter skinned. So this woman is darker skinned than her, and this woman, Mrs. Turner, she's thinking and says it was right that they should be cruel to her at times. Just as she was more cruel, she was cruel to those more Negroid than herself in direct ratio to their Negroness. So in this way, this other character is seeing Janie and is elevating her because of her light skin. You're better than me, so therefore you can insult me, just like I insult those who are darker than me. But Janie comes back, and her own defiance is, we're not so different from everyone else. We all have, she says, we's a mingled people, and all of us got black kinfolk as well as colored kinfolk. So she's saying we all are a mix of both. There's not a real difference. So through these societal beauty standards, both female characters are trying to overcome some of their childhood experiences and some of the influences around them. But Bride does so by leaning into the societal beauty standards, by making herself exotic, making herself something other in order to be liked by people. Whereas Janie entirely rejects those standards and says, no, we're all the same. Skin color doesn't matter. even though she's not making change in the wider world around her, she has an internal defiance and an internal courage to kind of speak out against that. The other theme that I chose to look at was the way that colorism and racism have impacted the way that the parental figures have interacted with these characters. So first, looking at God Help the Child. So Sweetness gives birth to Bride, and Bride is very dark-skinned, and Sweetness and her husband are not. So she's like, something's wrong, something happened. Where did I go wrong? What did I do to have a child this black? Her husband leaves her because he thinks that she slept with someone else, even though she didn't. And the way that she decides to parent Bride is with scorn and with distance, and Bride is constantly looking for her affection and she's not giving it. So one of the things that Sweetness says in justifying herself is, I wasn't a bad mother. You have to know that, but I may have done some hurtful things to my only child because I had to protect her, had to, all because of skin privileges. So she looks at the world around her and sees, here are all of the issues with the world, and my child needs to be prepared to enter into that world. So I'm going to treat her how other people are going to treat her, essentially. So kind of that tough love perspective. With Janie's grandmother, however, with Nanny, this is Janie reflecting on her grandmother, and she says, she was born in slavery time when folks, that is black folks, didn't sit down any time they felt like it. So sitting on porches like the white madam looked at a mighty fine thing to her. That's what she wanted for me. Don't care what it cost. So for Nanny, she experienced slavery, she experienced the hardships of that life, and she said, I want something better for my daughter, for my granddaughter. I want her to move past that. Now, the way that she does it is not helpful to Janie, it actually hurts her in a lot of ways. But we see that both parental figures respond to the world around them in different ways. Sweetness says, this is the way that the world is, and I just need to come to terms with that. My daughter needs to come to terms with that. Nanny says, this is the way the world was, and we can do better. And how can we overcome that? So why does any of this matter? When we're talking about these books, why are we comparing them? What does this tell us? The key thing is you see the progression of racism and colorism throughout history. Racism and colorism have both existed, and they are still around today. But there has been a shift from more overt racism to colorism pervading our society, especially as we have more and more people who are mixed race, more and more people who have some ethnic ambiguity. It's less of, oh, you're African American or you're Asian, so therefore I don't like you because you're that race. But we start to focus more on colorism and the view of skin color of, oh, you're more attractive because you're lighter skinned, or you're less attractive because you're darker skinned. So there has been this shift from it's because of your race to it's because of your color. And we see that with these novels written not quite 100 years apart from each other, we see how that has shifted. We also see the way that society influences people. A lot of this comes from these deeply ingrained views that are built into us because of the world around us. Because the way society perceives color, or the way that society perceives other races, that influences how we interact with the world. Even if we identify as that race or that color that is being discriminated against, in some ways we start to believe it because this is what society tells me is good, this is what society tells me is bad. For Bride, for example, she's like, I must be lesser than because I'm so dark, and she has to go through a lot of work to overcome that because it is so deeply embedded in the culture, not just in herself. And finally, we see just the consistency over the course of 100 years. Even though there has been this shift, it's still showing these problems still exist. There is still a lot of discrimination, even if the way we see it has changed. Even though it's taken a different form, it is still heavily prevalent throughout society, and it takes a lot to overcome that. And with that shift from racism to colorism, it is only recently that racism is becoming less of an issue and colorism is more of the focus because it takes years and years to break the mindsets that have been instilled in us. So then these were just a few of the things that I referenced. This article was actually very interesting. That's where I pulled the quote from about what colorism is. Shades of Brown, the Law of Skin Color. They went had a deep discussion of the impact of skin color, specifically in a law setting, but there's a lot of interesting information, so I also wanted to mention that, and then just looking at the novels. So that's all I got. Any questions? Yes, Trey.
I know you've read a lot of Morrison, and I guess I didn't realize that she was writing as recently as 2015. So for Morrison specifically, did you notice any change in her perspective on colorism or just the Black experience in general throughout the decades that she was active as an author?
So I actually haven't had a chance to read many of her other novels. I was hoping to, but I haven't gotten around to it yet. So I've read Jazz and I've read this one. I can't necessarily identify a major shift, but one of the notable things about this novel is that it is the first and only novel that she wrote for a contemporary setting. All of her other novels look back in time, and this one was set in the time that she was living in. So that's probably the biggest shift that you would see compared to her other literature.
Thank you.
Yes?
So you mentioned the example of Zoe Saldana. Certainly didn't produce. Were there other ones that you keep of similar examples of that in popular culture, in Hollywood, in other forms that you researched or you learned about?
A little bit. I didn't look in depth, but one of the ones that I had heard about a lot was when the Hunger Games movies came out. If you guys remember the controversy over the casting of Rue being a lighter-skinned actress, that was a similar situation of the way that she was represented in the books seemed to indicate she was probably much darker-skinned, and so casting her as a lighter-skinned actress was potentially a way to create more appeal for the character because lighter skin is often seen as more palatable on screen still. Yes?
Do you think this is an American issue or is it a worldwide issue?
I think this is a worldwide issue, but it comes across in many different ways. I actually had a really interesting conversation with one of the honors freshmen who came to hear about my project when we were presenting our posters, and she was talking about, she's from India, and in India there's a lot of this as well with skin lightening and a similar view of the darker you are, the lesser you are. So it comes across in different ways, but I think this is definitely something that pervades every culture, or at least a majority of cultures. Yes?
I'm curious, when you were researching criticism literature, if there's an overlap or the connection between colorism and passing, and that element, and if the element of passing was apparent in either of these novels or discussed, and how that relates. Is that a totally different concept, or is there a connection with colorism and passing?
I'd say there's definitely some connection. I didn't look into that much in my research, but specifically in God Help the Child, at the beginning of the novel, when Sweetness is trying to understand why her daughter is so dark, she talks about how in their family, a lot of their family history, they could have passed. It was either Sweetness's parents or grandparents were light enough that they could have passed, but they chose not to. And that's where racism was still very present, because they chose not to pass as white, and then they were treated in a particular way because they identified as African American. One of the examples was when they got married, they had to use a different Bible that was meant for Black people. So while I didn't look into it extensively, there definitely was an aspect of that.
I can see this impacting your practice and student teaching in your careers.
haven't thought much about that, but I
That's what I'm
think,
glad I asked you that.
I think just having a greater awareness that colorism exists is important in the classroom, and especially potentially working in more diverse settings in the experiences of my students. And understanding that this is something that is very deeply ingrained in us, even if we reject it, a lot of times we still fall into biases. So being able to recognize where I might be falling into those biases, and also recognizing some of the experiences of my students, and trying to create as much of a supportive environment as I can with that societal and cultural context.
Thank you.